Hello everyone, Mr. Jason here. Today I'm going to go over with you how to complete a plot diagram. A plot diagram is the skeletal structure of every story ever written, every TV show, every movie, every book, every play. They all have what's called a plot diagram. It is the makeup of the whole story arc inside of the story that you're watching or listening to or reading. Before I get into that, I just want to go over the importance of a plot diagram as a tool for pre-writing. Pre-writing in general is a very crucial part of the writing process. Some of you guys out there get so excited to write, and we love that about you. But at the same time, you must stop and take a few moments to plan your story out. Whether it's an outline or a brainstorming page, or even this tool I'm going to show you today, a plot diagram. It's super important that you take some time out and really develop your characters, really think about your plot points, think about where you're going to start, where you're going to have your climax, which I'll get to in a minute, and where you want to have the ending of your story. If you can think of all these things, the main guts, not every single nitpicky detail, like not what he said or what she said, or none of those things, just the meat and potatoes, general plot movements of your story. If you can get those written down first, it'll give you a roadmap to completing your story. Because a lot of times, if writers don't have some sort of pre-writing process, what happens is they end up with an incomplete story, right? They have an idea for a character, they have an idea for a plot, a situation, they write that down, and then there's either no beginning or there's no end, or what the characters are doing have no explanation, so the reader is lost, and you have like an incomplete story, or worse yet, you rush to fill in the gaps with just anything because you don't have any ideas. You're just like, I just want to slap a beginning and slap an ending on this thing just so I can be done with it. And then your story kind of loses its oomph because it doesn't really go together. So a plot diagram is my favorite way of pre-writing a creative story, and I'm going to share that with you today. So let's go. I'm going to share my screen and let's take a look at it. So a plot diagram. Let's see if it's, hey, it's already there. Wonderful. So this is an example of what a plot diagram structure looks like. I'm going to fill in all the details. However, this is what it looks like in its bare form. We have the first part here. The first part of your story is called the exposition. I'm going to type it here for you, exposition. This part of your story tells us the who, the where, oops, I can spell, the where, and the when. So whenever you're writing a story, you want to establish who are the main character or characters, where are we, and when are we. So oftentimes in a story, you will definitely meet your main character, which is also called your protagonist. This is where we establish that person. And most of the time too, you'll meet your antagonist too, the villain. And in some stories, there's more than one protagonist. There's a group of people that work together, not just one. And like Scooby-Doo or Finding Nemo, those are a couple of stories that come to mind right off the top of my head where there's more than one protagonist. And this is where you set it up. Who? So let's use Lion King for an example. In our exposition, our who's are Simba and Scar. Those are our antagonist, Scar, and our protagonist, Simba, our main character. Where are they? Well, the whole story takes place in, you got it, Africa, right? That's our where. And then the when, and this is what trips up a lot of people, past, present, or future. Now, some people would say, oh, it takes place in the past because that movie was made back in 1993 or 1994, or whatever year it was. True, it was produced back in 1994, but it was set in present day. The story, the when is present. Same thing with like Little Mermaid or Aladdin or any movie really. It's if Toy Story is another one that comes to my mind. Even though those movies were filmed in 1999 and 1995, those movies are still, if you made a plot diagram right now, it would be present day. Only movies that are set in the past, like your Cinderellas or your Peter Pans, that would take place in the past because they're set in the past. 1920s America, if I'm not mistaken, and Cinderella's even before that. You're talking medieval times. So, or future. Your future stories would be like Meet the Robinsons or Wally. Wally's another one that's set in the future, right? It's set up to let you know it's not happening now in current times. So our exposition: who, where, and when. This side of the hat, as it's called, is known as the rising action. And this segment is the steps that the protagonist, and I'll put an S in here too in case there's more than one, take towards, wow, that's really big font. I'm wondering if I can shrink that down at all. Probably not. Okay, well, I'm gonna try to move this out of the way as best I can to not cover up my entire, well, and I spelled the wrong. Let's get that out of there. So this portion right here of the hat, if you will, the plot diagram, is called the rising action, which again are the steps that the protagonists take to get to the climax. And spoiler alert, that's what the top is called. The top is known as the climax. This is the part of the story that's the most dramatic. It has the most action. Most of the time, it's the big boss battle, the final fight. Most of the other times, it's in a mystery. It's like the great reveal, who's behind the whole ordeal. Like in Scooby-Doo, when they lift the mask off, right? Or the mystery, and they find the perpetrator, the whatever it is, the Hardy Boys or something like that. A lot of people assume climax for action, like, well, if it's not a boss battle, if it's not something action packed, then it can't be the climax. So they're just thinking about all the parts of the movie where the action happens. And I'm here to tell you the true climax of any story is when your protagonist undergoes some sort of change, that they're affected by what's happened to them along the way. They've acquired knowledge. In the rising action, they've acquired knowledge. They've gone through tests. They've been challenged a little bit. They've increased their skill. They've increased in their confidence. And then something happens. Either they finally meet the boss and come out victorious, or something else happens. A best friend dies, or there's a major death in the story that changes them, and then they finally have the boss battle later as part of the falling action. Their inspiration is gone, and they just have to do something. It varies story to story. So in this case, I'm just going to write down when the protagonist changes. Well, I'll say undergoes a change. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at, I used the Lion King as an example a little while ago, so let's just keep with that. So exposition: Simba, Scar, in Africa, present day. That's our exposition. So rising action. The kids and I just watched this movie recently, so I'm gonna do my best to get it. Remember, we're not, with the rising action, we're not gonna be doing every single nitpicky little detail of the story. We're just gonna have the major plot movements that get us towards the climax. So first of all, Simba's born, and he goes to the elephant graveyard with Nala. Then Mufasa dies. That's the next major plot point. Mufasa dies. The next major plot point would be when he runs away. The hyenas are chasing him and he gets away. And then he meets Timon and Pumbaa. And then years go by of him hanging out. And then things get bad in the Pride Lands. And the next major plot point is when, and we're getting closer to the climax now, is when Nala finds him and realizes he's alive and invites him to come back. He says no. And then he runs into Rafiki, the little monkey guy. And this is the part right before the climax. Now, I'll give you a second to think about it. What is the climax for The Lion King? Time's up. The climax happens when Simba sees his father, the spirit of his father in the sky, the clouds, then he speaks to him, Simba, right? You got to go do what you got to do. Because Simba spent the whole first half of the movie, with the exception of the very beginning when his father was alive, the whole first half of the movie running from his responsibility. He was afraid, he was sad, he was scared. Afraid and scared of the same thing. I realize that now. But he didn't want to go back home. He couldn't face his mother. He couldn't face the Pride Lands. His uncle Scar said some things that messed with his head. And so he spent his whole young adult life um, running from responsibility, right? Hakuna Matata, no worries. Like he's shunning everything. So he's embodied that. He's grown into that philosophy. And so now when he sees his father, and his father reminds him of who he was and what his responsibility is, and that he shouldn't run from this, and then the fact that he died wasn't a big deal. You need to go back home and do what's right. And then Mufasa, and then Simba realizes who he is inside, and he runs back. Right. So the climax is when Simba sees his father and he changes, right? He changes from that irresponsible running away from my problems guy to, okay, I have a responsibility. I need to go save my father's kingdom and my kingdom and restore what was supposed to be there in the first place. So that he changed in that moment. Climax. Next, this little side of the arc here, this is called the falling action. And this is the aftermath of the climax. And here's the thing about the falling action. And you'll notice too, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that the length of my rising action side is way longer than the length of my falling action side. And this is done on purpose. Your climax in your movies or your stories typically happen about 60 to 70% of the way through the story. So if you're watching a movie like The Lion King and it's a 2-hour movie, let's just say for math purposes, I don't do math very well. So if you're watching a 2-hour movie, your climax would be somewhere around the hour and a half mark. If you're reading a chapter book and your book is 20 chapters long, your climax would probably happen somewhere between chapters 15 and 17 and go from there. If you're watching a TV show, that's the thing about TV shows. If there's, say, 10 episodes per season, every individual episode will have its own mini plot diagram. However, if you put all 10 episodes together, they follow one giant plot diagram, almost like Voltron, right? Or Power Rangers when their little machines come together. They're individually their own thing, but you put them together, they make one giant thing. So that's the thing about TV shows. So if you watch a TV series and there's 10 episodes, you put all 10 together and it makes one giant arc. So in that case, the climax would probably happen probably in the finale. So the last episode or last 2 or 3 episodes is usually like when that would happen. So that's why my right side of my triangle here is much shorter, because from the climax to the end of the story, which is called the resolution, which is the end slash or to be continued. It's a short run. So the falling action is usually a really small piece of your story. It's just the character cleaning up the mess or dealing with their success, their victory, or their defeat, and they come back in part 2 or book 2 and keep going. Now the question I get asked a lot is, well, let's say a series that has multiple books in it. For example, like Hunger Games or Percy Jackson or things like this, where there's several books in a series, or you name the series. If there's a book series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or you name it. If there's a book series with like 2, 3, 4, 5 books that go together, each book, right, has its own plot diagram. It follows its own arc, but you put the whole series together. So if there's 5 books in the series, just like the TV shows, all the books together combined make one giant story arc. So that's how that works, just like a TV show. So for you, before I close, I'm going to tell you how I use a plot diagram. So for me, when I'm planning a story, what's easiest for me is I start with my exposition. I always start there first. When I just draw the little design, the little triangle hat thing, and I'll establish my who, my where, my when. That's the first thing I always do. The next thing that I like to do when I write is I like to do my climax second. I skip completely over the rising action part, and I'll tell you why in a moment. I figure out what my climax part is, and that usually helps me figure out what I want to build my story towards. Or sometimes I'll write my exposition, and then I'll write my end, and then I'll do my climax third. But most of the time I do my exposition first, my climax second, and then I write my ending third. Depends upon the idea I have. So this gives me, if I do the exposition, the climax, and the resolution first, this gives me a starting point and a stopping point, and then a starting point and a stopping point for my whole story. So as I'm writing, I know where I need to get to. So then once I fill those two things in, filling in the rising action is much easier because I know where I'm starting and I know where I'm stopping. And much like the falling action, if I have the climax and the resolution filled in, my starting point and my stopping point are much easier to make because I know what gaps I need to fill in. So that's how I work. And then typically once you're done with this is about 80% of your story. It's almost done. All you have to do is go in and add some detail, add some characterization, like your physical description of your characters, some dialogue, conversations between the characters, and just some plot points that help move the story along and make sense. And then once you have this, you're ready to write your rough draft. And again, I highly, 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 highly recommend writing a rough draft. It allows you to get those ideas out. And then once you've written it, you can go back and make changes and edit it. That's the beauty of Google Docs. You can just keep modifying, 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 and you're good. So that is all for plot diagram today. I hope you learned something. I hope this helps you in your writing process. And as always, just stay hungry and keep learning. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.